An armed uprising in Russia has come to an abrupt end after the head of the Wagner mercenary group ordered his troops to stand down. Yevgeny Prigozhin abandoned his attempt to overthrow Russia's military commanders after striking a deal with the Kremlin. Wagner forces have now withdrawn from the southern city of Rostov-on-Don, where they earlier occupied the district military headquarters. Prigozhin says Wagner is pulling its troops back to avoid spilling Russian blood. The Kremlin says he will move to Belarus and all criminal charges against him and his soldiers will be withdrawn. And Russia's war on Ukraine rages on despite the situation at home. Ukraine's President Volodymr Zelenskyy says the armed rebellion in Russia has exposed the Kremlin's weaknesses and is putting the spotlight on fractures in the Russian leadership, an opinion shared by many Ukrainian citizens. Let's get more on the implications of these developments for NATO. Joining me now is DW Brussels correspondent Terry Schultz. Terry, NATO members appear to be very cautious about reacting to the events in Russia. Why is that?
That's right, Michael. Whereas yesterday we saw NATO leaders, especially those along the eastern flank, come out and say very directly that they were watching closely. They were concerned about the safety to their own territory. They were stepping up restrictions along the border to make sure even that Russians fleeing the current instability could not come into their territory. Today, they have been silent. NATO even yesterday did not have an official reaction other than to say they were monitoring events closely. And today, there's not even that, although there shouldn't be any doubt that they are monitoring things closely. But I have checked today, and there's been no official reaction.
How worried is NATO about Russia being potentially destabilized?
I think NATO is concerned about Russia in all its forms. Vladimir Putin has certainly posed the biggest challenge to the alliance since its creation. At the same time, I don't think anyone would be reassured by having someone like Yevgeny Prigozhin taking power in a military coup. So I think people would be very worried if there were a free fall in leadership in Russia. That wouldn't be good for anyone. At least now, NATO knows where the military bunkers are. They know where and how the nuclear weapons are stored, and all of that would become a gray zone if Vladimir Putin were deposed. So I don't think anyone is reassured by having Vladimir Putin continue in the Kremlin, but I don't think there could be many things worse for military planning, for preparedness, than not knowing who was in charge.
Speaking of preparedness, how prepared was NATO for these developments, or was it a surprise?
When we see reports like in the Washington Post today that say the United States has been aware since mid-June that Prigozhin was planning something, I think you can be pretty certain that NATO allies were also informed, being the ones that would be closest to any such instability in Russia. I'm sure that the intelligence was shared with allies. And let's not forget that NATO has just staged its largest air exercise ever right next to the Russian border. That just wrapped up on Friday. And so I think that if they were concerned, if they believed that there was something that was going to be happening that was truly a territorial threat to NATO allies, perhaps all those planes wouldn't have gone home. And as far as we know, they did. So I think they've kept an eye on this. They may have been aware that Prigozhin was planning something, and perhaps the timing was a surprise. But it doesn't appear to me, just from watching what we know about NATO movements on the ground, that they ever believed this would, at this point, be a threat to NATO allies themselves.
That is DW's Terry Schultz in Brussels. As always, many thanks, Terry.